Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out this evening. We are going to have a presentation, a discussion with Cindy Sheehan and Vince Emanuele. They don't really need, I think, a lot of introduction for everybody in the room, but we're here to commemorate, sort of. I don't know. It's one of those things that it's hard to figure out. You don't celebrate the beginning of a war. You know, you certainly don't do that. But you mark it in some way. And this is the United States' longest war, 18 years. No real sign that it's ending, although they keep talking about it. And it looks like we could be entering into a new incursion in the Middle East, just what we all needed. As you guys know, I'm sure, anybody in this room, Cindy Sheehan is a long-time peace activist, and we're going to give both Cindy and Vince an opportunity to tell you in their own words what got them started in the peace movement. Vince was in the Marine Corps, 2002, when he enlisted, and had 2 tours in Iraq. And when he was told to deploy a 3rd time, he said, yeah, no, I'm not going to do that, and started his activism shortly thereafter. Before I go any further, I want to make sure that I thank Grace Place and Eric Ramirez from CAN TV, who's taping this for us also, for future use, and our co-sponsors, Chicago Area Peace Action, the Chicago Anti-War Coalition, and Voices for Creative Nonviolence. So we all know when the war began and that it's continuing. So let me turn it to Cindy and Vince. Our format is going to be that they're going to have a conversation, you know. For those of us who are old enough, think Irv Kupcinet, you know. They're going to have a talk. And so I pass it off to Vince.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Martha.
All right.
So how did you get started, Vince?
How did I get started? Well, I grew up, like a lot of young boys on the southeast side of Chicago, in the shadow of steel mills, and from a family of ironworkers and carpenters and pipe fitters and steel workers and veterans. And you know, my parents were 2nd generation. All of my grandparents are either from the former Yugoslavia or from Italy. They came to this country. My grandfather came from Italy, settled in the United States, and then ended up fighting in World War II in Italy with the United States Army. My dad was in the Army during Vietnam. He didn't deploy overseas, so he got lucky, and come from a long line of folks in the family who joined the military. So it wasn't out of the ordinary, not to mention, of course, I'm a kid from the 80s and 90s, so you're talking action movies, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, video games and all the rest, sort of glorifying this kind of militarism and violence. I can't say that I joined post 9/11 for any patriotic reasons. I joined because I was a bored kid who didn't see myself working in the steel mills after watching my father get injured on the job, you know, broke his neck and his back, and has been, you know, permanently injured and disabled because of that. And so, you know, looking at that, I was like, man, I don't want to go to the job site, don't want to end up like all these guys, not to mention have people from the family who worked at Wisconsin Steel. Those of you from Chicago will remember Wisconsin Steel, Republic Steel on the south side. When those places close, families are shattered, lives are destroyed, people turn to alcoholism and drug abuse. This isn't an uncommon story for a Rust Belt town. And so I joined the military. And long story short, went on my first deployment, very sort of politically ignorant about U.S. foreign policy, joined the military, even though my dad told me I shouldn't join because I was about to go to another Vietnam. Me being 17, him being 60-something, I was like, you don't know what you're talking about. Of course he was right. After my first deployment, my friend took me to the San Diego movie theater to see Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11 2 weeks before our second deployment. That movie opened my eyes tremendously, and from there, it was clear that everything I witnessed during the second deployment, everything I participated in, was criminal and immoral, and there was no reason to do it or be there. They tried to send me on a third deployment after that second deployment. I quit and said, I'm not going, not picking up a weapon. They discharged me from the Marine Corps. My dad told me about an event at Valparaiso University. There was a debate taking place, one side for the war, one side against the war. He said, Vince, you should go to this event. Showed up to the event, was in the audience. They asked for audience participation after the event. I raised my hand. I said, hey, I'm a veteran. I'm with the side that's against the war. This gentleman in the second row with the black t-shirt on, Nick Egnance, if you could raise your hand. This was 14 years ago. 14 years ago, after I said that, and after the event was over, Nick Egnance came running up to me and said, have you ever heard of Iraq Veterans Against the War? I said, no. He said, well, you got to join. Come to this protest. We're protesting on Saturday. And that's how I got involved with the anti-war movement. Thank you. How about yourself?
Okay. It takes a very special type of courage to go against the grain. And we all know that after the U.S. was attacked on 9/11, if you weren't for them, you were against them. And interestingly enough, I grew up during the 60s, and the war, the Vietnam, the imperialist war against the people of Vietnam ended the year I graduated from high school. So I didn't really know anybody who went over personally. And I was kind of young to be involved in the protests, but I was certainly on the side of the protests. And I didn't know it back then, but I was also on the side of the Vietnamese people. And I know it now. I know that I was now. And so we kind of had the same situation as Vince. My son was 21 years old. He had already achieved his associate's in arts degree from community college. He was the oldest in a working class family, not a wealthy family, not a privileged family, a family that struggled every month, and he knew we struggled every month, and he was the oldest of 4 children. So he felt he was approached in college by an Army recruiter. And the recruiter promised him all kinds of things that never happened. I don't know if this happened to you, Vince, but he was promised a $20,000 signing bonus that he was to receive when he got out of basic training. He got about $6,000 of that $20,000. I don't know what their reasoning was. Education was really important to him, and that's why he joined, because he was promised that he could take classes while he was in the military, that they would let him sign up for wherever he was stationed. He could sign up for night classes at the local college. They never allowed him to do that. And this was in 2000 when Bill Clinton was still president. They said that he could have a laptop to take his online classes. He never got that. And the worst thing they promised him was that, and this was one that wasn't written down, but it didn't matter if it was written down or not. We didn't know at the time that the contract's only binding on the recruit, not the government. And so the recruiter said, you tell your mom that you scored so high on the ASVAB test that even if there is a war, you will never see combat. And when he told me that, I said, because we don't come from a long line of military. My ex-husband, who was my husband at the time, Casey's dad, was actually tried to enlist when he graduated from high school in '70. Because he had, as you older people know, he had a really low, what did they call it, lottery number, right? And so he didn't want to get drafted into the Army, So he tried to enlist in the Air Force, and his blood pressure was too high, so they wouldn't take him. So he dodged a bullet there, right? Literally dodged a bullet. And so we're not, his dad served in World War II. My dad was drafted. He was in the mid-50s, so, you know, he went to Germany, but there were like, no, he didn't have a shooting war to go to. I think it was 2 years at that time when you got drafted in between Korea and Vietnam. And so anyway, so we weren't like this long line of military people that's just what sons do, or now daughters. So anyway, he joined, and then a year after he joined, 9/11 happened. And then he was in the 1st Cavalry out of Fort Hood. And so they didn't go over till 2004. And he was there for a week. He was a Humvee mechanic. He had signed up to be a chaplain's assistant. And they said, oh, sure, you can be a chaplain's assistant, no worries. So he gets to basic training. They said, you can be, that MOS is full. That's ridiculous if you think you're going to be a chaplain's assistant. And it's almost like joining to be in the Army band or something, And so they said, you can be you can be a mechanic or a cook. And if you knew Casey, you would know how ridiculous that was, because he couldn't even change the oil in his car. And he couldn't cook either. So, I don't think cooking is a prerequisite for actually cooking in the military, but, And then, anyway, they were contracting that MOS out, right? So that was an MOS that they were bringing in contractors most of the time. So he was a Humvee mechanic. And he, on April 4th, 2004, the 1st Cavalry was taken over from the 3rd Armored Division, Camp War Eagle, in Sadr City, Baghdad. And so I'm not going to tell you the story we heard, which was complete bullshit. I'm just going to tell you that what really happened. And I learned this from soldiers that were near him when it happened. I've learned this from unembedded journalists. So I'm thinking that what I'm going to tell you is as close to the truth as we can get. The 1st Cavalry went in to Sadr City because they were taking over and they wanted to show the Iraqi who was boss. Right? So they went out on patrols. Well, this was only a few days after Fallujah, when Blackwater contractors were captured, tortured, and hung off a bridge. Not because the Iraqi are animals, but because Blackwater were animals, and the way they treated the people of Iraq. So there was already a sense of uprising on April 4th. And so the I don't even know what you call them, the units or the what would you call, huh? But well, it was just small groups of soldiers that were going out. So yeah, whatever. I don't know. The little group of soldiers that were going out were being attacked. And they were being ambushed because the people of Iraq had had enough. And so Casey went out, and his sergeant said, get on the truck, you're going. Casey's like, I'm not going. I'm a mechanic. And his sergeant said, get your goddamn ass on that truck, you're going. And he was shot in the head within minutes after that happened. So, the reason I believe that is the soldier who emailed me to tell me this story, because we were told, oh, he volunteered. He said, and his sergeant said, you don't have to go, Sheehan. And he said, where my sergeant goes, I go. And he was a great mechanic. And these were the officers left who could come to funerals and spread bullshit to the families. And that's what they do. That's what their job is, spread bullshit. Make sure when you leave, those people know that their son or daughter was a hero. And you make sure that they support the mission. And so then they told us that, is it okay if I say bullshit? I've said it several times. Okay. Already. I just want to check. And and they told me he was a great mechanic. I'm like, are you talking about the same Casey Sheehan that hated that job? He did re-enlist, but he re-enlisted to get a different MOS. And his deployment was, his enlistment was over during the deployment, but they said, Sheehan, you have to go anyway, it doesn't matter. They were stop-lossing him. So he re-enlisted to be Army intelligence, which I think is a funny oxymoron. And so anyway, I said, no, Casey was not a good mechanic. He hated that MOS. He called me every day, you're not talking to an idiot. And so anyway, his buddy who emailed me to tell me the story about Casey refusing to go on the mission, he told me Sheehan was a great guy, but he was a lousy mechanic. And I'm like, finally, somebody's telling me the truth. If he hadn't have said that, I would have just thought it's another story that somebody's trying to tell me. So anyway, after Casey was killed, I was already against the war. He was against the war. He said, I don't want to go, but I have to go. And the sooner I go, the sooner I'll come home, which was just weeks. You know, first they go to Kuwait, they leave and go to Kuwait, and then they stage there, and then they go into Iraq. But as far as we can figure out, they were only there for about a week before this uprising happened. And so I just got fired from my job for taking too much time off after my son was killed. So I had unemployment, and I had the death benefits. I was Casey's next of kin. And so I just started to network with people. And so by the time most of you heard about me when I was camping in front of George Bush's ranch in Crawford, Texas, I had been working with Veterans for Peace, Code Pink, Iraq Vets Against the War, Military Families Speak Out. I met Andy very early in my active. I don't know if I met you before or after Camp Casey, but I was starting to network with similar-minded people, and I founded Gold Star Families for Peace, which was an organization of family members who felt the same way we did. Interestingly enough, I'm the only one out of that group who's still speaking out. Even though the wars have continued, even though Obama expanded the U.S. war of terror against the world dramatically when he was president, I'm the only one out of Gold Star Families for Peace who's still active. So that's basically, to make a very long story as short as possible, that's how I got involved.
A little known thing that I'm sure you don't know, and I'm sure other folks don't know, but when we were sitting around in our barracks, when I was sitting around getting ready to get discharged, I was still watching MSNBC back then, don't beat me up too bad, but we were watching you on TV, and my friend Vic, who is from a Southern Baptist family in Kentucky, and my other friend Dave, who is from Oregon, were two of the people who sort of helped me, become politicized while I was in. And we're sitting in our barracks room, smoking pot in the bathroom, and to everyone trying to figure out what we had just experienced during our second deployment, and watching Cindy and company on TV. And yeah? Okay. Those kinds of things provide a lot of inspiration when you're in a barracks and you feel very alone and you feel very disempowered and you're not quite sure if anyone's going to stand up with you or if anyone's going to speak out with you. So this is, I guess, my first time to be able to thank you for providing that via the TV screen. You said that there were a few it's very similar for myself. I mean, I'm sure Nick and other people in the room will attest to this as well. Most of the folks that I became involved with are no longer involved with anti-war organizing or activism. And even myself, I mean, I'll speak out when I get a chance to, if I'm invited to an event, if there's something going on. But even us, we've been, it's been difficult to continue at the same pace that you do. I think, obviously for yourself, losing a son, for myself, losing friends and having taken people's lives that were simply trying to defend their homeland. There's a lot that sits with you. There's a lot of phases that you go through. I mean, I went through excited phases. I went through very depressed, probably drinking too much phases. I went through phases of feeling like nothing was going to change, periods of time when I thought that we were on the brink of potentially ending the war. What are the type of things, I know for me it's wide-ranging and we can get into that, but I wonder what are the type of things, other than, of course, the motivation that you carry with yourself because of what happened, but what are the types of things that have allowed you to continue? Who motivates you? Who keeps you inspired? What keeps you sane and inspired to do this work?
Oh, I'm sane? Can you guys hear me? He just said I was sane, so I want everybody, that was videotaped, right? So, first of all, my sense of humor. I am very irreverent. I find humor in practically everything. Even my sister and I, who recently passed, she passed, it wasn't recently, it was almost 3 years ago. She was my comrade, my colleague, my assistant, my best friend, my sister. Even at Casey's funeral, we got into a giggle fit. So we weren't laughing at the funeral, we were laughing at something that happened. But, you just get hysterical. Just like you're either going to start sobbing or you're going to cry. So, but what I started out to do when my son was killed was end the wars. And the wars have not ended. And in fact, they have expanded. So that kind of is like, oh my God, no matter how hard I work, nothing makes a difference. But that's not true. That's a lie. That's a lie that we're told and that we tell ourselves that we're not making a difference. Because even if we haven't ultimately been victorious in ending the wars, a lot of us have affected a lot of people in very positive ways. For example, I could have quit back in the winter of 2005 and felt like I had fulfilled a very good purpose in my life, because I was in Venice, Italy, and I was going to speak at an event in Venice, Italy. And so I was just sightseeing. No, wait. Erase. I was at the event, and after the event, two very striking white women with blonde hair came up to me. And then they started speaking in a southern drawl, and I was like, oh my God, they're gonna attack me. But they didn't. See, you make assumptions. And they said, we had to come, when we saw posters that you were speaking, we had to come see you speak. And it was a mother and a daughter. This was the daughter's graduation present from high school. She went to a small high school in Texas. And she said the most wonderful thing to me then, and I could have just quit and been satisfied. She said, every boy in my graduating class, which was about 30, because it was a small school, was going to join the Texas National Guard. After every single boy was going to join the National Texas Guard. After your protest, 0 of them joined the Texas National Guard. So you don't know how many lives were saved, how much sorrow, heartbreak, or whatever was saved because of just those 30 boys, young men that decided not to join. So yeah, and I'm sure Vince has prevented many young people from joining the military. So that's a victory. That's a victory for the person, for their family, for their community, and for the people of Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria or wherever the U.S. is currently occupying, attacking, has a base. You know, just because the U.S. might not be at hot war, it has 800 bases across the world.
That's right.
And everywhere there's a base. It's a Superfund site, toxic waste dump. There's a status of forces agreement that allows the troops to rape, commit crimes, sexual assaults, whatever. And so, yeah, I think that that is a tremendous thing. I don't know if this is a cynical analysis, but I know that ever since the United States has been a country, it's only not been at war for 24 years. You know, so the empire will probably collapse before we force it not to, you know, force it to stop. However, it could do something sane and stop and preserve the United States. So that's happened before. You know, Great Britain sort of stopped being a colonial power. But that most of the other empires have collapsed, but they've still continued in a different form. And so we here, and whoever we influence, we're the vanguard of influence to tell people that just because it's this way and just because it's always been this way, it doesn't always have to be this way. You know, and I've been trying ever since my son died to make war abnormal. Because I've been called crazy. It's nice that you called me sane. I've been called crazy and unhinged by both sides. Because I even dared to criticize Obama when he was committing his wars. And so I know, what about that? So, but you know what? The empire is crazy. The empire is unhinged. The empire is a murderous, vicious entity. And that's what we have to turn around to say, we, the ones who oppose it, we're the normal ones. So same with you. Same question with you. What keeps you going?
Well, you mentioned the primary victims of U.S. empire, so the people we've occupied. I would say having a chance to have traveled around the world, having a chance to have worked with different movements around the world, worked with different people, and having met literally hundreds of refugees from Iraq and Afghanistan, they always have the nicest things to say. They're always the most humble, generous people that I've encountered in the last 15 years. And so when someone who was the direct victim of the occupation comes up to you and gives you a hug and tells you that they forgive you, it aids tremendously in the process of forgiving yourself. And I think a lot of veterans, it is not a coincidence that 22 veterans are killing themselves every day in the United States, or that more Vietnam veterans have killed themselves than died overseas. And the numbers in Afghanistan and Iraq are like 3 times that who've died overseas. Mm-hmm. And that is probably, whether they say it or not, I'm sure a lot of you in the audience have friends, family members, uncles, cousins, nieces, nephews who've joined the military, who've went to war, and even if they haven't went to war, if you're a woman, you have a 1 out of 3 chance of being raped while you're in the military. If you're just serving in the military, you're 4 times as likely to serve in prison. You're X amount of times as likely to be impoverished when you get out, homeless, etc. A big process that I had to go through, and I think a lot of veterans go through, is just simply trying to forgive ourselves for what we participated in and what we did. And the Iraqi people helped me do that tremendously. And so that was the first step, I think, forgiving myself. And then I think the next step was, how do you do this in a reasonable, sustainable way? Because the punk rock fashion in which we were organizing with IVAW from 2006 to 2011 wasn't going to cut it. And what do I mean by that? That means on the road all the time, giving speeches, and not just speeches about U.S. foreign policy, which sort of brings us to the next point, which is like shifting away. This is actually the first time in a long time that I've had a talk about the sort of personal aspects of the war. some years ago, probably 7 or 8 years ago, I switched most of my talks into just straight up analysis or analyses of US foreign policy, US empire, strategies to defeat empire, what kinds of strategies or visions do we want for the future, a world without empire. Those are the kinds of things that I focus on. So moving away from those personal narratives and also, you know, finding healthy ways to live, knowing that there's going to be, you know, this might be a cynical analysis, but I was going to school at the time and taking a course in Western civilization, and it made me feel better. It made me feel worse that we had been at war for 5,000, 10,000 years in Western civilization. It also made me feel better to know that I wasn't alone, and that for many thousands of years, people had been at war and soldiers had come home all the way from the Iliad and the Odyssey and so forth, and these tales throughout time that sort of tell the story of extremely wounded individuals coming back and then trying to put their life back together. So context helped for me, historical context, and then shifting my energies to other things, you know, finding a lot of energy in the environmental movement, finding a lot of energy in organized labor. These days I run or help run a community cultural center that we opened up, and a large part of that was because we had come back from Standing Rock. A good friend of mine, Sergio Corrigan, and some other folks went to Standing Rock when that protest was taking place. And when we got there, we were excited, of course. You had thousands of veterans, thousands of indigenous people. In my opinion, that energy was sort of squandered by not taking a step further and breaking that line and actually going to the pipelines and locking down and performing some direct actions. I usually err on the side of caution because I've seen people get in a lot of trouble, unneeded trouble, not that you're not going to get in trouble, not that you're going to not have to sacrifice to have victories in this movement, but I think to be strategic when you're going to get arrested, to not fetishize it, that a lot of the people I know are poor working class, black and brown people, poor whites, and they can't just go get arrested for the hell of it. If they do, and they have previous charges, it could screw up their entire lives. And of course, treated much differently when they're in jail. In any case, we're at Standing Rock, we see an opportunity squandered, but within that, we saw a lot of hope. We saw thousands of veterans I had never seen before. You know how it goes. You go to a lot of anti-war events, and especially over recent years, you see the same faces in the same places, and it depresses you. At Standing Rock, it was much different. There were thousands of veterans from around the country working with indigenous people, hand in hand. And what we kept hearing from the veterans was that they were going home to nothing, that they could mobilize to these huge events and go to these big protests or these big gatherings, and they felt at home and they felt loved and they felt like they were a part of something, but that when they were going home to Wyoming or Ohio or Indiana or Tennessee or Arkansas or Montana or Northern California or Oregon, they didn't really have anywhere to go. They weren't connected with a local movement. They weren't connected with a local community. They didn't have local community connections. And that sort of forced Sergio and I to step back and say, well, what are some of the successful things? You know, he's spent a lot of time in India. He's in Ukraine right now shooting a documentary. You know, we've spent time in Europe, Latin America, Australia, working with movements and trying to figure out what works, what doesn't work. One of the key elements that we found was that almost all of the successful movements that we saw had a space or several spaces. And that's true, of course, also of the anti-war movement from the Vietnam era. Hundreds and thousands of coffee shops, community centers, student centers, homes that people turned into organizing spaces and countercultural spaces. We have to have spaces in order to get this work done. And we're living in a time when people are so alienated and so disempowered because of capitalism, because of technology, et cetera, et cetera. People aren't spending time with one another. You know, according to CNN, the average American spends 10.5 hours a day with a two-dimensional screen. You know, so it's hard to organize people, human beings, if you can't do what we're doing here tonight. Sitting in the same space with each other, face to face, as human beings, listening to each other, telling stories, learning from one another. So the long answer to that is it's went through many phases, and the question I have now for myself doing the work that we're doing is how do we translate that work into explicitly anti-imperialist, anti-empire work? There's a lot of people, the sentiment is there. It is easier today anecdotally and objectively. Objectively, look at the polling numbers. Anecdotally, what I'll say is it's a hell of a lot easier to talk to my neighbors and friends in Michigan City, Indiana, a pretty conservative county, than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Even my friends who voted for Trump, and I don't think we should overlook this, yes, his base is filled with some very reactionary, unsavory sorts. There's no question about that. They're my neighbors, they're my cousins, they're the people that I grew up with in a place like Rust Belt, Indiana. However, if you watch those debates from 2015, and if you look at the polling number amongst Republicans, there's a good segment of that party and a good segment of his base, whether it's from libertarian ideology, isolationist ideology, or otherwise, that do not want American empire. And it's something we should have been paying attention to 4 years ago. It's something we should continue to pay attention to now. There are a lot of people, including people on the alt-right, who agree with us on US empire. They don't agree with us on healthcare. They don't agree with us on socialism or whatever it is that you're into, or eco-socialism or whatever. But they do agree on empire. And in fact, you're probably aware, but Ron Paul and Ralph Nader wrote an interesting book. It's sort of 10 topics that the right and left sort of converge on. And one of the main ones was, of course, militarism and empire. And so it gives me hope. The infrastructure is not there. We know the organizations don't have the same money. The institutions that used to exist on the anti-war left just don't exist. And if they do, they're largely filled with older folks, not as much energy, not as many events and so forth. But the sentiment is there, and the people we're talking to, we can see that they're ready to be organized around these issues. I think it's a matter of getting into the communities and organizing them. I don't know what your take is or what you're seeing out there.
Well, I do want to agree with you on that, but on all that you said, I think, and it's an educated thought, it's not just some random thing I thought about, that many people who voted for Trump because they didn't like Clinton. And they saw Clinton as being a major representative of everything that they didn't like, right? And I didn't vote for either one of them. I always vote for either the socialist or the green. I still do vote socialist or green. I made a pact with myself and with the people who support me that I would never vote for another pro-war person, whether they were Democrat or Republican. And are we almost finished, Andy? So I am organized. Last year, back in January of 2018, I organized an event called Women's March on the Pentagon. And this was in opposition, it wasn't in opposition to the Pentagon, but it was also in reaction to the bougie women's march, the liberal women's march that refused to address militarism in its, in its documents or its rhetoric. And so we just said, well, we're women, let's have a march, but let's have it be against militarism and imperialism. Now, we're going to have one Friday called Rage Against the War Machine, and in Washington, D.C. And so we have seen a lot more younger people. Now, I am not an ageist. I don't fetishize the youth, but I don't also think every person with gray hair is wise. Or, but hey, I know what I am. I'm 62 and I have more energy now than I did, when I was 32. So I have, so this is me. There's a lot of young people who are full of shit. But there's a lot of there's a lot of old people, the same thing. But there's a lot of young people who get it. And I want them to be like the women I just interviewed with from Fury. I want to mentor them and help them come. They're sharp. They're sharp on ideology, sharper than me and some of those kinds of things. So that's what I think our job is, to mentor the youth and give them tasks, be on our committees to help us organize, but also give them something they want to come to. They're tired of the same old Democrat and Republican. Doesn't matter who's in the White House. I'll debate anybody about this. Doesn't matter who's in the White House. In fact, I think if Clinton were in the White House, we might be worse off in foreign policy than we are now. There definitely would be troops in Venezuela. There would have been, and she said this, she would have bombed Iran, you know, and so I think in that way we would be, let me read a tweet that Trump did yesterday. And or maybe it was today. What's today, the 9th? Yeah, it was today. I may have wrote it. Is that right? I may have written it. This is what Trump tweeted today. So at face value, it's awesome. I think Trump doesn't have any political ideology. I think Trump is just, his ideology is what benefits Trump. And what, you know, and what doesn't make Trump look stupid, you know, whatever. It's Trump. Trump is his ideology. But he tweeted this today. The U.S. has spent $8 trillion fighting and policing in the Middle East. Thousands of our great soldiers have died or been badly wounded. Millions have died on the other side. When have you heard a U.S. president even giving a shit about people that they murder? Right? He said that. Going into the Middle East was the worst decision ever made. Now, I may not have put great soldiers, because I think most soldiers fall into one of two categories: victims or war criminals, right? So I would love to think that they're all here, and some of them are definitely heroes, but why the hell are they there anyway? You know, why are they even put into the position that they're put in? So I think you're a hero for saying, no, I'm not going. You're a hero. And so Trump tweeted that. Now, I don't even want to go there because I don't want to take my sanity that's been verified today by Vince and try to go into the mind of Trump to find out what the heck. So we'll be in front of the White House on Friday to rage against Trump and rage against the Republican Party. And we are going to go rage against the IMF and bankers, rage against the Democrats at Farragut Square. They're half of the problem, if not a little more of the problem. We're going to rage against war profiteers at Booz Allen Hamilton, rage against think tanks at the Atlantic Council, rage against the corporate media and Jeff Bezos at Washington Post. He owns it. He exploits his workers. We're going to have labor there. We're going to have people who do truth, true media there. He maintains the cloud for the CIA. I mean, he has $114 billion and he won't give his employees health care or pay them a living wage. You know, it's like, how much money do you need? Right? It's not about how much they need, it's about how much they can hoard. It's all about hoarding wealth. So my point is, when we go to the White House, we're going to have a statement for Trump. And we're going to say, hey, are you one of us? You wrote this tweet. You know, and guess what? If you think it's the biggest mistake that was ever made, you are the only one with the power to correct it. Sign the order. Bring all our troops home. Don't just tweet. If you can tweet, you can sign an order, right? So I'm not saying he's on our side, and I'm not saying I want him to be on the board of directors for March on the Pentagon. But guess who is raging against Trump when he says, I'm pulling troops from Syria? I don't want to bomb Iran. I don't want to bomb North Korea. I don't want to get in World War III with Russia. Guess who rages against him? The Democrats, the liberals. They are all of a sudden red baiters, hysterics, 100%. I never thought the Democrats were anti-war, but Trump, the one good thing Trump has done has just totally exposed the system bare. And Trump needs to, even Trump didn't mean to do that, I'm sure. But he sure has. So that's one good thing about Trump, right? And we can't tell our brothers and sisters, you're a redneck, racist, fascist because you voted for Trump. Some of them might be, right? But we need the whole working class together to overthrow the system. It's not just going to be us that are still remaining on the left wing. And there's various degrees of left, right? Some people call Hillary Clinton on the left. I said, well, then what does that make me? If she's a left, there's not even a word for me in the dictionary. But we also need Democrats. We need Democrats to recognize that their party and liberals to recognize that their ideology is not one that serves the interests of the working class. And I'm talking about global working class that we need to be in solidarity with. We need to care their lives are worth as much or maybe even more than ours, because we're the ones that are making their lives miserable. Well, I say the government. The US government is the one that's making their lives miserable. So it's about solidarity. And it's going to take all of us to overthrow the system. I'm sorry, I'm talking too long. There was a recent uprising in Puerto Rico, and it ousted the governor in Puerto Rico. That was from all segments of Puerto Rican society. It wasn't just the people on the left, the revolutionaries who have long been separatists or independence activists. Everybody in Puerto Rico came out to get that governor out. But now it's up to the job of the people, the revolutionaries, the independence workers, to organize that in a very positive way. So they got the governor out, they got another jerk in, jerk S, I think she was. And so, but now it's up to them to say, hey, look what we did. Now we can become totally independent from the United States of America, working together this way.
We're going to continue the discussion here, but first I wanted to make a couple of important announcements and then pitch one last set of issues back to Cindy and Vince. First, we'd like you to get involved here in Chicago. It's not just DC. We've got a very important action coming up a week from today. First, though, please sign on our mailing list. It's going to be making its way around the room here. This event next Wednesday is going to be against our local war supporters in the Democratic Party, namely Mccleary and Jan Schakowsky, who voted for the record war funding bill recently for 2020. There's any number of other reasons why we should oppose them, but if we are not going to be hypocrites in the anti-war movement, we need to oppose both the Republican war makers as well as the Democratic ones. The former jerk who was governor of Puerto Rico was a Hillary Clinton delegate in 2016. So if the Puerto Ricans can do it, it's up to us to do our part here in very blue democratic Chicago.
Right.
So take a bunch of these flyers. They're on the back table there. There's stacks of them. It's not good enough to just go home with one of these. Go home with 10 or 20 or 50. They're back there. Please use them. It's 1 week from today. We know it's very difficult to get off work during the day, but that's when these damn representatives of the people have their office hours. And so we were forced to have our demonstration beginning at 1 p.m. a week from today. So you both touched on a number of more immediate issues in terms of the reaction, for example, to Trump saying he's going to pull troops out of Syria. But there are a number of other conflicts we can talk about as well that really reveal where the powers that be are, where they stand, for example, in the brewing conflict in the Western Pacific between the United States and China. Whether you're talking about NATO versus Russia. And you've also got our quadrennial charade called the presidential elections. And many of the Democrats, whether you're talking about Bernie Sanders or people to the right of him, promising all sorts of social programs. And yet we've got this huge war budget. And each of these candidates, of course, have got their records in terms of voting for stuff. So I'd like each of you, if you could, to comment on those. And also the United States' #1 ally, which is Israel, and what Trump has done to Israel and the Democrats' role in all that. And I believe that we here in the United States have a particular responsibility to stand with Palestinians. So if both of you could comment on that, please. And then we'll open it up to audience participation.
Well, the good news is, as far as Israel is concerned, there's obviously been a growing movement worldwide. Public sentiment in the United States has shifted drastically. There's actually a great book about this by Norman Finkelstein called Knowing Too Much, the Israeli-American love affair with it, or the American-Jewish love affair with Israel coming to an end, something like that. But it's Knowing Too Much. He runs through decades of public polling. And what it shows is that the younger generation of American Jews are overwhelmingly opposed to the occupation and overwhelmingly critical of the Israeli state. This is also good news. Obviously, I think it's a negative, but it's also a positive in terms of how strong the movement has been. You've seen legislation directly targeting groups like Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, BDS movement. The reason they're finally being targeted is because they've been quite effective over the years. And so I think there's great hope to look for in terms of domestic organization around that issue. In terms of NATO and the US and Russia, I'll leave that for people like my friend Sergio, who's not only from the Ukraine, but has studied the region and is shooting a documentary there. I pick his brain when he comes home. What I will say is that the narratives that we've heard both on the left and the right and in the center and in the corporate press and in the left-wing independent journals is not quite as nuanced or complex, I think, as the situation is on the ground, as is often the case. With regard to the South China Sea, I've spent significant time in Australia. The last time I was in Australia, I had a chance to work with the anti-war movement in Australia, who's been, at the time, was opposing the TPP, which was being pushed by Barack Obama to sort of surround China with military bases and economic agreements to hopefully, quote unquote, contain them. There was a raging debate in Australia at the time. In fact, one of their former prime ministers, Malcolm Fraser, had just wrote a book about how Australia needs to break its diplomatic ties with the United States and form a larger bond with China. And that's a conservative, in their country, Liberal Party former prime minister. So this isn't a left-wing guy. This is actually quite a conservative gentleman. And he wrote that book before he died because he said, if he could do one thing before he died to change the situation in the Pacific, it would be for Australia to distance itself from US empire. And the Australians are in a very interesting situation. So thinking of like strategic leverage points for who has power in that region, China is wholly dependent on Australia for mining their rare earth minerals and all kinds of mining that Australia does and then exports to China. And then of course, China sells back cheap goods to the Australians, but that their cultural and diplomatic foreign relations, Australia's that is obviously aligned with the West, primarily the United States and Great Britain, but their economic ties are wholly dependent on China. And so this rift has really put that country in a very interesting situation. What they choose to do, or what people force their government to do over the next 5 to 10 years, I think will have pretty radical ramifications throughout that part of the world. You asked about one more issue, Andy, I'm sorry.
Impeachment, the candidates.
Oh, goodness.
The charade of...
Yeah, I mean, it's clear, well, this, in my opinion, in some levels, kind of falls on us. We don't have a movement. The anti-war movement is not, it doesn't exist anymore. So what do you have during the presidential debates, or what do you have nationally? You have candidates addressing issues that they're being forced to address. And no one is forcing any of the candidates to address any of the issues when it comes to militarism, U.S. empire, or U.S. foreign policy. There's been, again, as we talked about before, tremendous movement. We just saw it with climate change activists, people fighting against ecological devastation. Unions have been on strike more in the last 10 years than they have in the last 30 years. There's been great movement in certain sectors of left-wing movements, but the one movement that has remained quite dormant has been the anti-war movement. And I think that's reflected. As Cindy said, it is true that there's very little difference between the presidents, regardless of whether it's a Democrat or Republican, when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. But I think one of the ways that you're going to get people to stop joining the military is if you have, and to Andy's point, you have to, I think, address U.S. foreign policy and U.S. empire and draw the contradictions between trillions spent abroad and austerity at home. But in the meantime, if the choice is between a Joe Biden or some right-wing lunatic like Trump, or somebody like Bernie Sanders who wants to provide social programs for people, programs that, in my opinion, would be one of the strategic leverages that you need to get people to stop joining the military. In other words, if people had free education, free college, and free healthcare, free housing, and didn't have debt, 95% of the guys that I joined with wouldn't have joined. So I think there's a strategic reason to support that campaign and to get involved. It doesn't have to be his campaign. Any local, county, state person who's running under a democratic socialist to the left socialist and so on platform, I think should be supported, because not only does it make moral sense, not only does it align with my values, but I think it makes strategic sense in terms of trying alleviating that need or that want for people to join the military. So even at our county level or at our municipal level, because I live in Indiana, a state that's so regressive, for instance, I'll just give you a little rundown of like what we're limited in doing. We can't raise the minimum wage above the federal level. It's illegal at state level. We can't have sanctuary cities because sanctuary cities are illegal at the state level. We can't raise income tax rates, corporate tax rates, or sales tax rates at the municipal level because it's illegal at the state level. So what you're left with in Indiana are municipalities who are completely hamstrung, and municipalities where if you are in a position of state power, or if you even have some kind of influence over state power, you have to get very creative in terms of how you're going to provide services to people. So one of the things we've been thinking about are what are the kinds of things people can do on their own outside of the state apparatus. You know, what could we do? Community health care centers. What can we do to provide dental? What can we do to provide child care centers? How much of this can be done by the community, and how much of that would alleviate the pressure for people not only to join the military, but also the tons of single moms and single dads that we know in an area that's been ravaged by deindustrialization? How do you give them more time to engage in the kinds of things that Cindy and I and others engage in? That's not to say that there aren't people in extremely impoverished situations who don't know how to do that. That's just to say that most of the people that I'm living around are like either in a crisis or one crisis away from being totally desolate. That means no house, no car, no health insurance, friends and family who are in and out of jail, friends and family who are addicted to opioids, friends and family who are addicted to alcohol, friends and family who are dealing with depression, anxiety, and so forth. You know, whatever we can do to give these, to alleviate some of that pressure and to give some space to people to actually organize, to actually fight back, because I don't want it to get to the point where the empire just collapses or where it gets so bad. Why? Because I've spent enough time in failed states to know that once it fails, there is no guarantee that it's going to go back in a positive direction. Just ask the people of Somalia, ask the people of the Congo, ask the people in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Syria. It's not getting better there anytime soon. So once society collapses, all of your chances for changing anything or making it a better place are almost gone. There is no empirical evidence to suggest that we should just let things collapse, or that it would be better if things just collapsed and then we just work from there. So what we have to do, in my opinion, as anti-war activists and organizers, is to focus more on building organization and building institutions and less mobilizations. So yes, we've had tons of mobilizations over the years. As I mentioned, Standing Rock, standing out for me, the hundreds of mobilizations during the Bush years. But we didn't really talk about strategy or tactics during the Bush years until well into the Obama years. So I was a member of Iraq Veterans Against the War for several years before we even had a discussion
about short-term victories, short-term goals, strategies, vision, tactics, and so forth. It took years. So I like to think back positively on those years, but I also think there was a level of naivety and ignorance around organizing during those years that is quite striking to me in hindsight. The last thing I'll say about that point is that there's a great Iranian director, Amir Amirani, who wrote who directed a film called We Are Many, and he's following the pre-invasion protests in London, but around the world, but primarily in London, the largest protests obviously in human history, the only protests before a war had ever started, so on and so forth. And he's interviewing these activists in the streets, and you wouldn't believe your ears. I mean, to me, I had to laugh at it, but it also made me sad and angry. But they're interviewing these protesters in the streets, and they're going, they can't stop us now. There's hundreds of thousands of us. Or, there's no way, we're gonna make them see that this is the wrong thing to do. These sort of like moralizing politics, that if we just show the politicians that they're morally wrong, that they're gonna somehow change their class interests or change their national interests. But you were hearing these things from people, and we were hearing these things, I'm speaking anecdotally, but I was hearing these things well into the first couple years of Obama. And then finally, after the NATO protests, did we sit down and go, okay, wait a minute. The NATO protests here in Chicago when we returned our medals weren't quite what the anti-war protests were under Bush. That was the last, and I would think that I can remember, major anti-war mobilization, particularly in Chicago. And really people I think a lot of us went back to the drawing board and said, okay, wait a minute. Some of us remained steadfast in anti-war organizations and tried to continue to work. Other people said, wait a minute, maybe it makes more sense to go work with other movements and try and educate them on US empire and militarism and so forth. Obviously, the direct connections I've seen so far have been with indigenous groups, frontline communities who are making these connections quite easily, because these frontline communities, like the black and brown people who live in East Chicago, where housing complexes are being destroyed because lead was found in their water 400 times whatever the acceptable rate was, they're making the connection because their cousins are the ones going to the military. Indigenous people are making the connection because of the history of colonialism. Other people are making these connections. They're right there. I mean, obviously, we were also in Ferguson with Veterans for Peace, and a lot of the Black Lives Matter organizers and activists have made the connection between militarism abroad and militarism at home. But there hasn't been an infrastructure, an anti-war infrastructure of organizations that are growing, that are winning victories along the way, and that becomes very hard to tell someone just to join this group, or just to join because this is the moral right thing to do. It's a difficult pitch, and I think those of us who are sitting in the room today, if we're thinking about how do we build an anti-war movement that can deal with US empire in the coming century, it's going to take a lot of difficult conversations about mistakes we made along the way, things we would have done differently, things we can improve upon. And I think sometimes we fall into this position of constantly praising each other because we are such a small group of Americans who are involved with anti-war organizing. So there's a line, I think, there's a balance. We want to support each other. We always want to be supportive of each other. But in order to grow, in order to actually defeat US empire, we're going to have critical and difficult conversations that I think, for any number of reasons, personalities, ideology, sectarianism, etc., have gotten in the way of the movement having those conversations.
Okay, so thank you, Vince. When I said that I wanted the empire to collapse, you came back with societies that didn't collapse, they were destroyed by US imperialism. And so the US is a major hegemonic power in the world. And a collapse of empire would mean a collapse of all the systems that support empire. And we don't have to just be involved in one movement. I was at Standing Rock. I was at all these places also. I'm involved in some things in my community. But like Iraq and Afghanistan had advanced societies before the US. And in the 80s, it was the US proxy, the Taliban, Mujahideen, sorry, against the USSR. And so that was like a proxy war that destroyed a country that was becoming more advanced. The US destroyed Libya. Libya didn't collapse. Libya was making great strides. And all these things we want in the United States, that some of us want in the United States. And the US empire could not see a country making advances like that, or even saying, we're going to go off the gold standard. We're not going to sell our oil for gold anymore. So, and when I look at, I think local elections and local organizing are way more important than the presidential election. And so I see like people say, oh, Sanders is terrible on foreign policy. Well, to me, that is the bottom line. It's like, even if Sanders or somebody could go into office and say, and Sanders, the president can't do this, by the way, and all of a sudden we have healthcare and education that's free from preschool to university, housing, you know, we start to spend on cleaning up the environment instead of destroying the environment. First of all, the Pentagon has more fossil fuel emissions than Portugal, right? It uses more fossil fuels than 140 countries, right? Everywhere it goes is a Superfund site. So having an environmental movement that doesn't address foreign policy or the military is ridiculous. But also having a democratic socialist movement that doesn't say, to do all this, we need to stop spending $3 billion a day on empire. You can't do any of that stuff while the US is still murdering people and slaughtering people. So it's kind of a catch-22. So, and even if a president could come in and wave a magic wand and say, we have all these social programs, you know, we just like created the money out of thin air, which they usually do anyway, and we just made all these, but we're still bombing people, I wouldn't want any of that. I don't have health care. I haven't had health care since my son died because I got fired from my job, right? I gave up my car because I'm like, how can I buy gas when the US military is used to protect oil fields? When the US military, that's foreign policy, is control of resources. Why do you think they care so much about Venezuela? Because it has the biggest oil reserves of any nation on earth, right? So, and so even if we could get all these social programs, I would reject them if my country was still killing people. And that's why, like, if we get involved in US elections, you guys obviously can do whatever you want. I'm just gonna make it. If I get involved in bourgeois presidential elections, it's gonna be somebody who will say that. You know, we want these social programs by stopping the slaughter of innocent civilians around the world. That's a candidate that I would get behind 100% if they would do that. If they call themselves a Republican, if they call themselves a Democrat, but you know what? I've come to find out in my 62 years of life, politicians lie, especially to get elected. So, so that's basically, I think you covered the other things very well, especially the Western Pacific. I know China is getting more involved in Latin America because China is using money and like programs to help, working with programs to help the people. And is Stan still here? Did Stan? Because I know Stan does a lot of Latin American. He's not? So I just thought China was going to help. This is good. Hey, I was, let me see. Was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 62 or 63? 2? I was 5 years old, 6 years old. I still remember it. I remember how frightened my adults were at that time. So China I think this is going to go over big with the empire. China is offering to help Cuba build a nuclear reactor. So you think that that's going to, like, they're going to go, oh yeah, I mean, they won't even believe Iran's not enriching uranium for a bomb. So, and I'm not for nuclear power, but I can also go and flip a switch and have power whenever I want. Not so true in Cuba. Not so true in Latin America, where China is using cash diplomacy, not military diplomacy. And the United States also has something that they consider very dear. It's called the Monroe Doctrine. So, I think a lot of that Trump and China and all that stuff has to do with the waning of the influence of the U.S. hegemon and the growing influence of powers like Russia and China. So, but I think that that's pretty much. I think we should be 100% in solidarity with Palestinians. I always say I'm for a one-state solution, a Palestinian state. And, but I think we should be in solidarity with all occupied and oppressed peoples of the world.
Just a couple things. The one thing I was going to say about the collapse generally, but also some of the states I mentioned are a direct result of the U.S., but generally having state institutions collapse has been bad for people and throughout time. And so this gets back to the question of capitalism. There's been wars in empire prior to capitalism for thousands of years. So this idea that if we just get rid of capitalism, wars are going to go away or empires are going to go away, I think is totally naive. And I think it's a misreading of 10,000 years of Western civilization. As far as consumer activism is concerned, I just don't buy into it. It's a privileged position to be in.
I'm with you.
And, it's like, as far as like purchasing cars or gasoline or any of this stuff, that's just not my thing. And as a matter of fact, if you think you can avoid the military-industrial complex, I highly suggest you read Nick Turse's book, The Complex. Because as soon as you open a can of Colgate in the morning to brush your teeth, guess who has contracts with the Pentagon? Colgate, and so does your toothbrush company. And so does the company that makes the faucets for your sink, and so does the company that provides the soap for your bathroom. So this idea that you're going to avoid all of those things at this point, it's not even reality. As far as climate change is concerned, I totally agree that the climate change movement should add empire, but like a lot of young movements, and like I said about the anti-war movement, there were tons of issues the anti-war movement didn't touch on. I remember being in the anti-war movement, organizing events and strategy sessions and national conferences where people just tried to bring up issues like feminism. People tried to just bring up issues like systemic racism, racism within a movement. I mean, look around the room tonight. I'm not an identitarian, and I've written extensively about identity politics and have given interviews about the topic. But the reality is, you can't have a movement that's not representative of people demographically. So for me, am I fetishizing young people or people of color? Hell no. But if anyone in this room thinks that the anti-war movement can continue as an old, white, gray group, it's not going to happen. So where do we go? We go to the places that have energy. So you go to Black Lives Matter meetings because that's where young black people are organizing. You go to climate change activism or climate change rallies or climate change events because that's where young people are organizing. Doesn't mean you allow them to sit there and just have their politics and don't be critical. It means that you have to go into those spaces and educate people. You have to go into those spaces and work in solidarity with those folks and try and get them and expose them to politics they otherwise wouldn't be exposed to. The same way I was exposed to politics back in 2008 or 2009 when I thought, okay, empire is the issue. Yes, it's connected to racism, but I didn't understand what decolonization meant. I didn't understand indigenous struggle until I was in Australia speaking with Aboriginal people, explaining to me 400 years of their history. I didn't understand those things. So I think we have to remember what it's like to be younger activists and organizers and know that if we want to make a diverse movement that has the potential of building power in the future, just like the Bernie campaign. So local activism, where we're at in Michigan City, where we have a cultural center and a community center that's open 7 days a week, that we hold organizing events out of, cultural events, educational events, and so forth. We use that space also. I mean, the groups that use that space are Citizens for Syrian Refugees, local environmental campaigns, local organizing bodies, but also the Bernie campaign is using that space. Why? Because it's bringing dozens of people through our doors who otherwise wouldn't be exposed to politics left of Bernie. So anyone who wants to change liberals' minds, if you think you're going to bring conservatives and liberals on board with left-wing politics, guess what? We're going to have to engage with them. And guess how that happens? Going to where they are with their politics. As my friend Leora Keith says, you meet people where they're at, but you never leave them there. It's not about staying where someone's at. It's not about going to the lowest common denominator. It's about going to where the energy is and where people are, and then hopefully getting them to grow along with ourselves. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. Most of the people that run that community center on a day-to-day basis, and most of the people who are active in our local organizing efforts, are people that we made bonds with in 2015 during the Bernie campaign.
I just have one thing. I just have a response. So I didn't sell my car and quit buying oil because I thought I was going to completely divorce myself from the military-industrial complex. I did it for me. I did it for my own principles. And I don't pay taxes. I haven't paid taxes since my son was killed. I regret I ever paid taxes. But do I think the $30 a year the US government doesn't get from my income is going to stop imperialism? No, I do it because it's from my principled center. And I never have said, oh, like, I don't pay taxes, I'm better than you, because you do, because I know there could be a risk. And I accepted that risk, but I'm not telling anybody else they have to accept the risk for not paying their income taxes or whatever. And so, and I agree that we have to be where people are, but it's okay to be there and be critical, to be critically supportive. But it's also okay to be critically in opposition also, you know, when we have these things. So, and I don't use Colgate because I don't want fluoride in my body. Not because I think it's going to collapse the military-industrial complex. But, you know, and I think that absolutely Vincent has the right ideas of being where the people are. We need to be where the people are. And I love young people. I want them in my movement. But I hate going places and people always say, where are the youth? Well, there's a youth. You know, I see some youth. You know?
I'm 35, I am not the youth.
To us, well, to me you are. And so,
I'm 5 years above
and so he's the youth to me. So, so it's just like, we're gonna need everybody, right? But just, it's like, I don't know how to explain it. It's like I have a center. I have like this moral center, and I'm not saying my moral center is better than your moral center, but I'm saying there's some things that center prevents me from doing or compels me to do. And I'm not saying that that's the same moral center that should impel you not to do things or compel you to do things, right? So I'm just saying what the things that I do and the things that I believe in. And the anti-war movement, one thing I wanted to say, I think a lot of it has to do with everything that you said, but a lot of it has to do with also this partisanship. The anti-war movement were mostly Democrat partisans. And when Obama was elected, that's when, well, first of all, when the Democrats came back into power in 2007, that's when it started to really wane. That's when IVAW had something in DC called Winter Soldier. They told me they don't want me anywhere near Washington, DC for their Winter Soldier event because I was running against Nancy Pelosi at the time, and one of their don't words was Democrat. Another one of their don't words was empire. So we welcomed them and paid them to come to Camp Casey because we thought their voice was important. And then in 2008, they're saying, we don't want you anywhere near Washington, D.C. because of partisanship. You know, and I think that is like one of the number one things that killed the anti-war movement was this partisan, and I didn't see Obama do anything positive, even nationally. You know, Black Lives Matter happened when our first Black president trademark was in office, he didn't prosecute any killer. I don't have to go over this long list. We'll be here forever of things Obama did or Obama didn't do. And so I think that the major failing of the anti-war movement was partisanship. And that's why we're trying to build this anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, pro-human being movement out of the ashes of whatever experience all of us who come together have brought us to where we are today.
Okay, let's give a hand for both Vince and Cindy. They're not off the hook yet. They're not off the hook yet because we're going to give you an opportunity to make comments and ask questions. But before we do that, expanding on the theme of solidarity, tomorrow night at 7 p.m. in this very room, the Chicago Teachers Solidarity Committee is going to be having an important pre-possible strike meeting. Please come here. For those watching on Facebook, we're at 637 South Dearborn, 7 p.m. tomorrow night. Possible strike beginning October 17th of not only the teachers, but a whole bunch of the support staff, not just in the schools, but also in the parks. I'd also like to thank again our co-sponsors for tonight's event, including Chicago Area Peace Action, Chicago Veterans for Peace, Voices for Creative Nonviolence, and of course, Chicago Access Network Television, and Eric Ramirez for spreading this word much farther. This film of tonight's event is probably going to be broadcast on CAN TV several times over the next few weeks, and we will share those broadcast times on the Facebook event. So what we'd like to do right now is invite you to participate in the conversation. We'll take a handful of questions and comments, pitch it back to Vince and Cindy. Maybe we'll have time for, I think we'll take about 4 or 5 at least. So please raise your hands, and we're going to ask you to use the microphone here so that people can hear. So I'm going to get here and then get you, Betty, there.
Hello, Greg Bardick. I'm an NNU. I just wanted to say something about the tweet comment. I appreciate what you said and agree with you on all this stuff. But I thought in addition to where you were, the tweet you read was interesting and good, except for the fact that the context of it is that it's a nice, true statement that he's used to make bigger lies.
Right.
So he never says anything that he doesn't automatically contradict. So during this time, he was saying that, he was going to get out of Syria. He bombed Syria on Hillary's plan. And them pulling the troops out of Syria right now, those aren't all the troops. And ISIS isn't, ISIS isn't somebody that the United States and the CIA doesn't know, like al-Nusra. They're all armed by the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. So he pulled out of there for some deal with Erdogan, God knows. But this guy, he dropped the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan, the fuel air bomb. This guy wants peace with North Korea, except for the fact that I almost had a panic attack 4 months ago when he said there was, 3 aircraft carriers going there when there weren't, because he's going to wipe out the country with an atom bomb. So whatever the guy says, he mixes, like NPR, he mixes nice, positive things in with just complete Barnum and Bailey bamboozling bullshit lies. It's part of the deal.
Right.
So that was a very nice thing that he said, but it's completely mixed with filth. So it doesn't matter. It's meant to further the lie, not to further the truth.
Okay, and we had Betty over here.
Oh, okay, can you hear me?
That was for recording.
Oh, okay. Hi, I just wanted to build on what Cindy and Vince said, to just say a word about where we are. I think we have a reason to celebrate victories. The biggest victory I think we've had over the years is we've won some battles in public opinion. Right now, overwhelming sentiment in the country is against these never-ending wars. That is not a small thing. If you think back about people you know and so on, that is a change. and it's the change that we should build on. We can win further battles, bigger battles in public opinion. And I'll tell you why I think so and what a kind of thing I think we should do. Working people that I see every Saturday when I distribute a newsletter in our neighborhood to working class people is that they are interested in talking about war. They realize who is benefiting from war. There are things they don't realize, but they want to talk about them because the working class, unlike a lot of educated people, are open. They know some street smart things, and you can talk to them because they don't think they know it all. So one thing that I've noticed recently that has some potential that I'd like to encourage other people to consider is that we have made use recently of petitions. For example, we have a petition now, and we've been using it, that says, call on every congressperson and every candidate for president at meetings, at public events, and tell them to stand up and be counted against war and promise to actually do something against war, or we'll boo you off the stage. And people, a petition doesn't in itself change anything, but it's an opportunity for discussion. And that's what we have found. When we ask people to sign a petition, they say, what is it all about? And it starts a conversation. And my opinion is, we're not going out enough among the people, working people. And that we have to do that, not because it's a moral imperative, it is, but because we can win. We can actually win victories. And without public opinion that is very clearly informed and clearly targeted against real enemies, such as Democratic politicians running for office, we can actually activate people. So we have to both change public opinion and use that as a way of activating people to take actions which we have to be creative about. But I'm optimistic. I believe we can win the battle for public opinion and build on that.
Thank you.
Okay.
So I have a question for you, Vince. Well, both of you, but I think you pointed out some really solid issues that we've had of the huge mass mobilizations over the past couple of years, and then they've dwindled off to where it is now, of like worse and worse things happening and people aren't coming out onto the street. And also seeing that one of the problems in the movement is the lack of community and the lack of one-on-one interface and mutual support. Instead, it's this individual burnout for individual gains. And so I like the concept of the community center and providing services, but I guess the question that I have, especially with where I'm at in life and organizing and future, is how does that avoid the NGO complex? And how does that avoid, because what Black Lives Matter was born out of was this incredible movement, and what it's turned into in more recent years is not that. Mm-hmm. Is the bourgeois, whatever, the petty B politics. So how, and the same with the Sanders supporters. Like, I constantly wrestle with this question because these are the people who I interact with most right now, is, are those the people to organize with? Is there potential there?
I am kind of a newbie at this public public speaking deal. So if you bear with me, I will struggle through it. My name is Stephen, and I identify as multicultural, but in some circles I identify as Black. Some circles I identify as Black African American. And I have been involved in the peace movement long enough to remember when we were talking about the peace dividend. And I was going door to door in a predominantly white neighborhood on the north lakefront of Chicago before Harold Washington was elected mayor. And I was going door to door because I was involved in that movement to get people educated about what they had power to do in terms of who they elected to the most basic office, which is their alderman. Now, what does that mean for a peace dividend? These aldermen are part of a political organization that keeps putting judges in place, state's attorneys in place, mayors in place. And one of the reasons that we don't see many Black men in the peace movement is because they're in jail, in prison, or in the military. When the alternative to getting out of a drug-infested ghetto that was created by white supremacist institutions of this country, by majority white people who voted for them and continue to vote for them out of ignorance. Well, if you're in jail, you're in prison, when you get out, the chances of you going back into prison are over 70% because your life is destroyed. Now, I'm a clinician, clinical social worker, master's level. I understand systems. And so my question to all of us is this: how have we as individuals looked at how white supremacy is supported by us? Because it is on an individual level. If you're comfortable sitting in spaces like this, where you don't see any Black man, what is that about? Me even saying this to you is going to, I don't know if you can deal with it right now, and I suggest that you don't. Think about how you feel with a Black man telling you things that you aren't doing anything about, but it's part of the movement. And my question to all of us, especially the panelists as well, what is our vision, what is your vision for that community that we don't have now, if what we have now, empire, were to collapse after Trump is out of office? That's number one. And how do we get there? Now, Cuba is a great model for the world because their energy is sustainable. They get a lot of their energy from natural means. And if Cuba, island nation, 50-year blockade can survive, then what is it about that model that we can take and build now in our communities? And I'm a member of the Religious Society of Friends. I am the only Black male in the entire state of Illinois that's a member of this organization.
Wow.
And the reason I am a member is because I believe in the peace testimonies. I believe in Quaker values. And I talk to Quakers like this, and let me tell you, they do feel uncomfortable. But there's a lot of Quaker organizations like American Friends Service Committee that is in Palestine. There are more Quakers there are more Africans and people of color coming into being Quakers than there are white. Now, If Quakers can do that, and Quakers don't look like the people that they are recruiting to come into their midst, why can't we do it? And the last thing I want to say is Chicago is ground central for organizing. Black Lives Matter is a coalition of organizations. They are a member of Stop Police Crimes Organizing Committee of the Chicago Alliance Against Racist Political Repression. What does that mean? Every weekend, the Stop Police Crimes project for the Alliance is doing tabling in communities where they are trying to get people educated about how they can change what is going on in their lives and what is going on in this city. And pushing legislation is one of the ways that we can do that. And if you think you're gonna get out of electoral politics, we are gonna be in concentration camps. In those prisons that have been built, that black men are in, and that this country is moving immigrants into, if you think you're gonna not vote, and you don't want that, what are you gonna do? Where do you go? And Obama said it very clearly when he ran for Senate and when he ran for president. Your organizing is what's gonna force me to do what you want me to do. So why did we stop?
Okay, I think we've got time for maybe one more question or comment, then I'm going to pitch it back to Cindy and Vince. Any takers? Right back here, okay.
Thank you. Thank you. I just had a question also about, and there have been some great questions and comments, so it's awesome to hear all these ideas. I think also that we might be able to look more at the myth that is very widespread. I think that weapons can protect people. And, you know, we see that in communities here in Chicago. If there's violence somewhere, you know, to send in more weapons, heavier armor, and then that's definitely what we do abroad as well. You know, we kind of cover what we're doing by saying, well, we're saving people, we're protecting people. More weapons. Weapon sales celebrated by Democratic and Republican parties. So maybe we can also help break this myth that weapons are a way to save people or protect people. And so there are groups, I'm involved with a group that does unarmed civilian protection, and there are groups that do that in Chicago as well. Cure Violence is one of those groups. The group I'm involved with is called Nonviolent Peaceforce, and basically they have interaction with the communities where they're trying to de-escalate or end violence, and people from the community are involved and are leading the projects, and basically it's without any weapons at all, going in and de-escalating the situation. And I think that this helps go against the myth that we've had for so many years that, you know, a good person with a gun will stop a bad person with a gun, which probably most Americans still believe. And so I think that we can help also, you know, young people who are being recruited into the military, if they hear there are other ways to solve problems, constructive ways instead of destructive ways to solve problems, that might be a seed in their mind to help them say, well, rather than pick up a weapon and go solve a problem, I'm going to look into this unarmed protection that has been going on now for 30 years, some of these groups all over the world. And it's on a very small scale, but it seemed like it could be scaled up so that, you know, we're recruiting more people who are using unarmed practices than are using weapons. Just wondered if you guys had heard much about unarmed civilian protection as a way to solve problems.
I don't know.
Whichever you wants to go.
Do you want me to go?
Sure, go.
Or you can go. You have the mic back now. The guy, the friend who said something about the Trump tweet, did he leave? Yeah, I said Trump was all about Trump. I don't know. I have no idea why he tweeted that, except I don't think he all of a sudden turned into a peacenik. You know, the Congress just signed like the largest defense bill in history of this nation. So all of them need to be held accountable for what they say and what they do. Many times what they say does not match what they do. I don't care if they're a Democrat or a Republican. So I completely agree with them and that's why last year when we did Women's March on the Pentagon, we strictly tried to leave Trump out of it because we believe we're a nonpartisan movement against a bipartisan war machine. So if we were going to hold one side accountable, we were going to hold both sides accountable, right? And that's what we're still trying to do. And so this year, we figured Trump has more than proved his imperial credentials. So he needs to be held accountable, and that's why we're going to start our thing at the White House. So I think we have public opinion is on our side. One of the advantages of not having a car is I get to dialogue with all kinds of people in my town. California has one of the highest, probably the highest number of homeless people because we're the most populous state, right? And it's not as uncomfortable to be homeless in parts of California as it is to be in many other parts of the country. So I dialogue with people, and I'm with you, Betty. The homeless people get it. We don't have to explain it to them. They obviously get the problem and what the solutions could be. And I think I loved it when you said petitions don't do anything, but they bring an opportunity for discussion, which is trying to win the battle of public opinion. The mass mobilizations have dwindled, and I think I'm just going to go back to, I saw Black Lives Matter was very energetic. The Dakota Standing Rock was very energetic. I'm kind of leaving Standing Rock not as an example of what I'm talking about, but the youth gun movement was very energetic. But when a movement comes out and says, the way we're going to solve it is by getting out the vote for Democrats, that's when the movement starts to wane. That's when the movement becomes a partisan political movement and not a social movement. It happened to the anti-war movement. It happened to me. You know, Democrats courted me after Camp Casey. They said, Nancy Pelosi, my arch enemy, Nancy Pelosi, she said to me to my face, Cindy, if you help us take back the House in 2006, we'll help you end the wars. Well, guess what? I believed her. That's my fault. You know, if you play with a snake, a poisonous snake, you're going to get stung or you're going to get bitten, right? So, you lay down with dogs, you're going to get up with fleas. And so my problem was that I wanted to believe them. And that maybe is the issue with movements like Black Lives Matter and the anti-gun movement is these dastardly, vicious, lying politicians want to co-opt the movement for their gains. Well, guess what? The Democrats did take back the House. Guess what? Nancy Pelosi became Speaker of the House. And guess what? She forgot my name, right? And so yeah, I think that it has a lot to do with it. And I think young people especially are discouraged by this betrayal of partisan political movements. And as for Bernie Sanders, I saw a lot of people, especially in 2016, he had way more cachet than he has in today. But I saw a lot of people who were very excited about Sanders really get a really quick political education when he said, vote for Hillary Clinton, the person he was running against, right? And the people who voted for Trump because they didn't like Clinton. The people on the other side who rallied around Sanders also didn't like Clinton. But again, some of them said, okay, we're going to vote for Clinton. But some of them became radicalized. And those are the people, the ones that became radicalized, that we're working positively with. And it might happen again this time. But why does it take the charade of the circus of presidential electoral politics every 4 years to radicalize people? Because all this stuff happens between elections. The worst stuff happens, and I think now we're in 100% election. It's 100% election season, like year round, every year. It's always about elections. And you blew my mind, brother, when you said, what is it like to be white and sit in a place with no black people or maybe one black person? And I just read a quote today. It's an old German quote. Well, it's not that old. It said, I wrote it down because it blew my mind also. If one person sits at a table with 9 Nazis without protest, there are now 10 Nazis sitting at the table, right? So your question is going to take way more thought because that question blew my mind. However, I had an interview before this happened with some anti-imperialist feminists before the thing started. And they're like, how can we get people to not join the military? And so that's a real difficult question because there's no opportunities, right? There's the school, there's the high school to military pipeline. There's the school to prison pipeline. There's jobs that are menial, that are humiliating, that pay very little. And so we can say, don't join the military, but do we have alternatives to offer these young people? And so the idea of community centers and the community rallying and support to give young people opportunities besides joining the military. I have a son who wanted a college education and he was killed. I have a daughter who wanted a college education and she's $50,000 in debt. So this is a monstrous, callous society that we live in. I've been to Cuba many times. And I think, like you said, if that tiny, Cuba is my inspiration. Cuba is my hope. I go there to be inspired, to be filled with hope. I was speaking at a Cuban university last year. I was telling the people we had dinner with last night, I was telling them what my daughter had to go through to get an education. She had to go into debt, she had to work, she had to get loans, she had to, live at home with me, rent-free, to be able to, and they have the right attitude. education is a human right, not a privilege for the wealthy, right? And so our young people have to either join the military and have all kinds of potential harm, and maybe it's often difficult, I understand, for veterans to access the care or the benefits that they're promised. And you have to be very self-motivated, I've heard, to access all of those things that you're promised anyway. And when you come back from war, maybe you're not so motivated to do much. And so anyway, so I was telling these young Cubans what our young people have to go through, and they were looking at me like I was making it up. And I'm like, I'm not even telling you everything about what students go through. If they qualify for university, their housing, university, there's no such thing as tuition. You know, their food is provided and support is given if you qualify for university. And if you don't, there's apprentice programs that you go in to learn a trade, which is a wonderful system because not all of our young people are college material. And, you know, they recognize that in Cuba. And Cuba has community organizing in Cuba and Venezuela is their energy. It's like, and in Venezuela, the government works with the communities instead of working against them. I was in a community that said, hey, you know what? We need a cable car because we're tired of climbing 1 million steps every day back and forth to go to work, to go to market. And so you know what the government did? They said, well, let's have some meetings. We'll pay for it. You design it. And well, you know, they're just not going to have like, you know, you work on the design, you work on every aspect of building this thing, and guess what? We'll hire you also to build it. And if they had to take houses out, they build much better replacement houses. Under the Bolivarian Revolution, they've built almost 3.5 million housing units that are either low cost or no cost, depending on your ability to pay for them. So when we talk about these things, when I graduated from high school, university was almost free. We did it before. We can do it again. You know, but we were at a lot of wars and stuff like that. But that's in 74, 75 is when the empire said, you know what? We're going to get rid of forced conscription, but we're going to start charging more for college. And like you said, so young, poor people, working class people, people in disadvantaged communities, they see no other alternative besides joining the military. I think nonviolence is always my energy, but I believe in self-defense. And I believe in the peoples who are being occupied right to self-defense. And so, but the violence usually comes from the police state, the counter-revolution. You know, the revolution, there would never be a revolution if the assholes in power would just leave and let us take over, but they rarely do that. So in a perfect world, there would be no weapons of mass destruction. And that's what, I just saw Dick's Sporting Goods melted down all their assault rifles. They didn't even try to sell them somewhere else. They melted them down into something else. And so I think that's positive. And they're not selling their multiple round magazines or whatever. I don't know what the things are called, but I do believe in the people's right to self-defense, basically. And it's really sad because my son was killed by somebody defending himself or herself and his or her community, but he shouldn't have been there. And it's not his fault and it's not their fault.
So moving backwards,
and then forwards, because that's something that we've thought a lot. I mean, you had a lot of veterans get out of the military. They're impacted by that violence, but then they've seen how people have had to defend themselves from that violence. So as Cindy mentioned, you know, you have these instances throughout time. You have the Vietnamese who defended themselves and had every right to. The Palestinians have every right to. But anything and everything we can do to move towards nonviolent solutions, I'm 100% for it. And so with regard to community violence, you know, we live in a pretty small town where I live, 30,000 people, about 1/3 of them are black. 60%, if you're using real numbers, live in poverty. You know, there's a coal-fired power plant. There's a maximum security prison that executes people. You name it, we've got a casino. We've got anything and everything you can imagine being in a frontline community. It exists in Michigan City, and to a worse degree in East Chicago, Whiting, Hammond, and Gary, Indiana. So anything, I would like to talk with you because I think while we understand that these systems produce the context through which violence takes place, the majority of murders in Chicago are not by the Chicago police.
Right.
And the majority of the murders in our city are not by the Michigan City police. That work sounds very interesting to me personally, because a lot of what we've been talking about at the community level is what kind of alternatives to traditional policing can we provide without the state. I mean, so part of it, yes, you want like a civilian oversight committee or a board that has teeth and all the rest, but we know that those things could be rolled back. What are the kinds of like base building community operations and projects that you could implement that would build the kind of trust and bonds in the community that would dictate that you wouldn't need the police or people wouldn't need to call the police? So our friends who are on the police department tell us that the majority of their calls on a Thursday, Friday, or Saturday evening are usually domestic violence. So it's an old man beating up on his lady. Capitalism didn't make him do that. Patriarchy existed long before capitalism. So this idea, again, that if we just get rid of these institutions, that all of a sudden it's going to filter down and you're not going to have men beating the shit out of their wives on the weekend because they've had too much to drink. And yes, they are upset because they no longer have their factory job. And yes, they're upset because they no longer have their health insurance. But it runs far deeper than that. And so it's very difficult to go to those women at the Stepping Stone Women's Shelter in Michigan City and who are going in there by the dozens on the weekend and telling them, hey, we want to abolish the police, because usually if you talk with those women, the police basically saved their lives. Is it a different story for black people in the city? Absolutely. But most of the black people we organize with in the city are more interested in de-escalation tactics. So what you're doing is super interesting to me and very prescient to the kind of work that I'm interested in. You asked the question about it's built into mobilization. The woman to read on this topic is Jane Mccleary. She is the best union organizer in this country. She's been a part of all of the major organizing efforts that you can name, from the nurses' strikes to the teacher strikes in Arizona, Kentucky, and beyond, to the Chicago Teachers Union, to the local nurses who are just striking. She's at the center of those. She wrote a book called Organizing in the New, No Shortcuts, Organizing in the New Gilded Age. She's largely talking about the difference between advocacy, so think of Sierra Club, lawyers fighting battles in courts, a couple of high-paid lawyers or a couple of highly paid Ivy League-educated professionals who kind of take over the struggle. You've seen this a lot in environmental battles, especially against fracking. Mobilization, which I would largely say the anti-war movement has always fit in this mold. So you have the same faces in the same places, small numbers of people who are dedicated, who can get out large numbers of people, but whose organizations never truly grow. They're not building a base, they're not building membership, they're not winning victories along the way. And then an organizing model, which is the exact opposite of that. Constantly training new leaders, constant mentorship, winning victories, growing your base, gaining members. Those are sort of the key elements, and that's like a very distilled version of that. So I think it's built in when you ask, why do these movements burn out? I mean, I think we have a tendency to call things movements when they're not really movements, when they're just like, in my opinion, sort of internet gatherings of people who can find a place, agree on a few values, and then largely they go home. Or they move into other work. I mean, most of the people that we were involved with during Occupy moved on and did other more substantive work. You cannot sit in a park forever. As far as the Sanders campaign is concerned, I mean, I think it, to me, is outrageous to consider it some kind of petty bourgeois thing.
the majority of the people donating to his campaign work at Starbucks, Walmart, and so forth. So if you think the folks that work at Starbucks and Walmart and so forth are petty bourgeois, I don't know what to tell you. And where we live, that's where the majority of working class people are orientated around. I definitely agree with Cindy that it shouldn't be that way. I mean, it shouldn't be that it takes every 4 years for new people to come into the mix. But for a lot of Americans, the first time they're involved with politics is going to be through electoral politics. So then the question for leftist organizers is, do you want to be in that space to bring them along, or do you think that standing on the other side of the street, they're just going to come to you? They're not going to come to us. The anti-war movement is a great example of that. And most of the poor people and working class people in Northwest Indiana, which is why Indiana went for Bernie, are people who support Sanders. And you're talking about, again, I live in a city that's, you can't name other than Gary and a few other places, that's more of a frontline community. It's the only political organization, electoral organization, that exists in the county. The Democratic Party virtually doesn't exist. The county party doesn't exist. And to the extent that they do, they don't do anything. The Sanders campaign has offered an opportunity to bring together a lot of people in the community who otherwise would not be working together. And most of these people, again, are like single moms, people who work at Walmart, people who work at Ace Hardware, servers and cooks from our local restaurants. So that's been our experience. How do we avoid the NGO complex? That's a question we ask ourselves every day. Is it built into the structure? Are there democratic mechanisms? Can you allow sort of a small group or a small clique to take over power? How do we come to decisions? How often are those elections? How much do we rely on foundation money? Not much for us, you know? In fact, virtually all of our money comes from small donors and fundraisers. So we have small sustaining donors giving $1 to $5 to $50 to $100 a month, depending on what they can give. And we have fundraisers that bring the community together. That's how we fund our operations, with the understanding that people come in and they don't think they're going to have some job that's going to take them years and years and build up their resume by coming and working at the community space. That's not what our space is about. I just got done reading Arundhati Roy's book, Capitalism, A Ghost Story, and what she talks about in that book is that yes, NGOs have been catastrophic to movements in India, but there are also essential NGOs in India that if those NGOs didn't exist, the work simply wouldn't exist. And so this is my concern with Occupy, or a movement like that just kind of fades away, never becomes an institution, never actually develops into something. I don't think that wasn't important, but I think we want to actually build institutions that will outlive us. That's one of the beauties of a place like the Highlander Center and others. As far as public opinion is concerned, the woman back there with the scarf, I think this makes great points. Betty?
That's Betty.
Betty, I think those are great points. That's exactly the same thing we've noticed, anecdotally speaking, being in a Rust Belt area, an area that went overwhelmingly for Trump. We have noticed that there's a ton of people, black, white, poor, middle class, working class, who absolutely are interested in talking about U.S. foreign policy and are 100% sympathetic to the message that we bring them. I don't want to touch on Trump's lies. Cindy hit that. I mean, he's trying to privatize the war in Afghanistan. So on the one end, he says he's going to pull out troops. On the other end, he wants to privatize it.
Same Obama did in Iraq, right? Yeah.
And to the gentleman in the blue shirt, individually, how do I think about it? I can't say that I think about it quite often on an individual level. I think about it collectively. And so collectively, how are we dealing with white supremacy? We're creating a community space in a city that's disproportionately black, and then allowing the black people in our city to have a say in exactly what that space does, who we have there, what kind of events, what kind of speakers, what kind of campaigns we run, and putting them at the forefront of our efforts. And so collectively for me I view most things that way. So it's like, yes, individually you want to be less of whatever, be nicer, all these things, but I think collectively, the best way I've seen things like white supremacy and sexism and homophobia dealt with is through collective class struggle. And
usually superior to the individual, collective is superior to the individual.
And if you can have something you're collectively working on. So what I've found is getting in a room with a bunch of white folks and just wanting to talk about white supremacy detached from something that we could work collectively on has been a disaster.
in what I've seen. But what I've seen it work is when we're working in tandem towards a collective goal and dealing with those inequalities within that.
Awesome.
So that's been my experience with that. I think that's the last I'll say because I'm sure Andy's like, let's go. But yeah.
Great job.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for our co-sponsoring organizations, Chicago Veterans for Peace, Chicago Area Peace Action, Voices for Creative Nonviolence, and of course, Chicago Access Network Television for broadcasting this. Thank you very much.